Before we go any further, pause for a second. Take a breath. Seriously, slow it down. This isn't about blaming anyone, getting revenge, or stirring up old anger. This is about clarity, clean, grounding, nervous system level clarity, the kind that finally lets your mind rest. For a long time, you've been stuck wondering why your ex moved the way they did. One minute they were warm, open, almost magnetic. The next, cold, distant, gone. They pulled you in, then dipped without warning. They cracked open emotional doors, let you peek inside, and then slammed them shut like nothing happened. And you were left replaying everything, asking yourself, what did I do wrong? Was I too much? Not enough? Here's the truth Spirit keeps circling back to. None of that behavior was random, and it was never about your worth, not even close. What was really going on had nothing to do with you being unlovable or asking for too much. It was about an internal war they were fighting and losing long before you showed up. A push and pull between craving connection and being absolutely terrified of what real connection would force them to face. Growth, accountability, change. This message isn't here to drag them. It's here to pull you out of the mental maze. Because confusion keeps you emotionally hooked. Clarity sets you free. What Spirit is showing goes deeper than mixed signals or bad communication. Your ex wasn't emotionally unavailable in the obvious way. They were emotionally selective. They knew how to turn on the charm, warmth, vulnerability, and intimacy when it worked in their favor. And they knew exactly when to shut it down the moment closeness started asking something back. That hot and cold cycle, that wasn't confusion. That was a defense strategy they perfected over time. They learned how to keep people chasing without ever letting themselves be fully seen. They didn't lack feelings. They lacked internal boundaries. Instead of learning how to protect their heart in healthy ways, they learned how to dodge emotional responsibility. They confused intensity with connection, attention with love, and then you came along. You didn't just bring affection, you brought presence. And presence is threatening to someone who survives by staying slippery. You didn't chase the way others did. You noticed patterns. You felt shifts. You asked questions without always saying a word. Your energy clocked things before your mouth ever did. That alone rattled their system. Here's where the uncomfortable truth kicks in. On some level, they knew being with you would require them to let go of old versions of themselves, old habits, old emotional shortcuts, the identity that allowed them to disappear without consequences. They were standing at the edge of something real, and instead of stepping forward, they panicked, because beginnings demand endings, and endings demand accountability. So instead of grounding themselves, they escaped. Instead of choosing truth, they chose movement, distractions, situations, validation, even drama, not because they wanted more, but because stillness would have forced them to face themselves. You weren't meant to fill their emptiness. You were meant to reflect it. And that reflection, way too uncomfortable for someone who wasn't ready to heal. Spirit exposes the real reason their behavior felt so contradictory, and why their fear of connection had nothing to do with love, but everything to do with control. What hurt the most wasn't just the distance. It was how fast things flipped. One day you saw their softness. The next day, emotional withdrawal so sharp it felt personal, almost cruel. But Spirit wants you to hear this clearly. That switch wasn't calculated manipulation. It was fear reacting to intimacy. They felt you were different. Immediately, there was something familiar about you that didn't feel safe to them. Not because you were dangerous, but because you touched something unresolved inside them. You activated a memory of who they could have been if life had gone another way. And instead of leaning into that truth, they recoiled from it. That's why their behavior felt so inconsistent. It wasn't about playing games. It was about internal collapse every time things got real. Spirit emphasizes this hard. Their hopelessness existed before you. You didn't break their belief in love. They already believed lasting connection wasn't meant for them. And when someone carries that belief, they don't wait for love to fail. They sabotage it first. That way, they stay in control of the ending. That's why everything felt self-destructive, because it was. But it was familiar self-destruction. And familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar healing. There's a big message here about boundaries. Not the ones you wish they respected, but the ones they never learned to build inside themselves. Without internal boundaries, they relied on chaos to feel alive. Confusion replaced structure. Distance replaced honesty. Mixed signals replaced emotional responsibility. You, on the other hand, showed up with integrity. Even when you were hurting, you still wanted clarity. That contrast made them feel exposed. You didn't need to accuse them. Your consistency did that all on its own. Here's the darkest part of the secret Spirit keeps highlighting. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't lies. It was avoidance. Avoidance of growth. Avoidance of self-reflection. Avoidance of owning the emotional impact they had on others. They told themselves leaving was kinder than staying and changing. That story helped them dodge guilt while protecting their self-image. But deep down, they know they walked away from something real because they were afraid of who they'd have to become to keep it. Their elusiveness was never power. It was survival. They learned early that being fully known led to pain, so they stayed just out of reach. They kept people guessing because certainty once disappointed them. That strategy may have protected them once, but it destroyed their present. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. And honesty feels like exposure when you've lived behind masks. Spirit wants you to release this with no bitterness. Yes, they cared, but care without courage causes harm. Love without boundaries becomes chaos. And connection without accountability turns into a wound instead of a bond. You didn't imagine the depth. Those moments were real. They just weren't sustainable for someone unwilling to let go of old emotional patterns. In next part, Spirit flips the focus back to you, revealing how this connection quietly rewired your self-worth, sharpened your intuition, and protected you from a future that would have cost you everything. Now Spirit shifts the spotlight, and this is where everything clicks. This exposure isn't about dissecting their psychology anymore. It's about stopping the part of you that kept internalizing their absence. Their inconsistency was never a reflection of your value. It was a reflection of their fear of transformation. Think about how much energy you spent trying to understand them, replaying conversations, softening your needs, explaining yourself differently, hoping clarity would keep them close. That chapter ends here, not because you hardened, but because you finally see clearly. Seeing clearly doesn't make you cold. It makes you free. Spirit talks a lot right now about release, but not dramatic closure talks or final messages. This is internal release, the kind that happens when confusion dissolves. You don't need answers anymore because you understand the mechanism behind the behavior. You don't need an apology because you see the limitation they were operating from. And that understanding, it's for your nervous system, not for them. This relationship didn't enter your life to last in its original form. It came to recalibrate you. You thought the pain was the lesson, but the confusion was the catalyst. Confusion creates awareness. Awareness creates growth, and growth changes what you're willing to tolerate. While they were avoiding transformation, you were walking straight into it without realizing it. Every pause instead of reaction. Every moment you sensed something was off and stayed compassionate anyway. Every boundary you felt forming internally. You were learning discernment, reading energy instead of words. That skill isn't built in comfort. It's forged in uncertainty. Spirit says the connection was asymmetrical, not in care, but in direction. They were running from themselves. You were being guided toward yourself. That's why it felt exhausting. You wanted grounding. They wanted escape. Here's the truth you need to hear. You didn't lose them because you asked for too much. You outgrew the version of yourself that would have accepted too little. What they called pressure was accountability. What they called intensity was depth. What they avoided wasn't you. It was the mirror you held up without trying. Will they ever realize what they lost? Maybe, maybe not. Awareness takes courage. Some people repeat the same lessons in different faces forever. And if realization comes, it'll come quietly, long after the door is closed. You're not meant to wait for that. What matters is this. Silence feels different now. Not like punishment, but peace. You're no longer checking, no longer rehearsing conversations. That's not detachment. That's integration. You've absorbed the lesson. Your standards didn't change overnight. They rewired themselves through experience. You no longer confuse chemistry with safety, effort with depth, struggle with meaning. Your body learned first. Your mind followed. And that's why you can't go back. You're entering a cycle where mixed signals feel unattractive, where chasing feels exhausting, where consistency feels grounding, not boring. You're not closed off. You're specific, and specificity is magnetic. If this message hits something deep, if you feel calmer instead of triggered, stay close. What's coming next is about recognizing healthy love without mistaking it for familiarity. Spirit shows something really important here. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The more honest you became with yourself, the more off balance they felt. Not because you turned cold, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped doing emotional gymnastics to keep the connection alive. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped translating their behavior for them. You stopped filling silence with hope and excuses. And the moment you did that, the whole dynamic lost its glue, not because love disappeared, but because self-abandonment did. That shift might look small from the outside, but energetically, it was massive. A lot of people can handle distance. What they can't handle is losing control over how they're perceived. Your ex wasn't scared of being alone. They were scared of being seen clearly, without the mask that inconsistency let them hide behind. Ambiguity was their safety net. When things stay undefined, people get wiggle room. They can dodge accountability, rewrite the story, tell themselves, I never promised anything anyway. But clarity shuts that door real quick. And clarity is exactly what your energy brought into the space. Even when you weren't saying a word, Spirit wants you to notice how often you felt the truth before you had proof. How your body clocked things before your mind could explain them. That wasn't paranoia. That wasn't imagination. That was discernment switching on in real time. You were learning to trust sensation over justification. And once that started happening, the connection couldn't survive in its old form. Not because you messed it up, but because you outgrew what the dynamic needed in order to function. There's a reason they kept bouncing between closeness and distance. That wasn't indecision. That was emotional regulation through avoidance. When intimacy got uncomfortable, they pulled away. When distance felt empty, they came back. That back and forth kept them from sitting with either feeling long enough to actually change. You, on the other hand, were willing to sit in discomfort. You didn't need constant motion to feel okay. You didn't run from confusion. You tried to understand it. And that meant you were playing a completely different emotional game. Spirit says this is why communication always felt half finished, not because words were missing, but because intentions didn't match. You communicated to understand. They communicated to manage perception, truth versus control. Those two don't meet in the middle. Here's the part that really lands. Your ex benefited from ambiguity. It gave them care without commitment, intimacy without responsibility, access without reciprocity. When you started seeing that clearly, the benefit disappeared. And when the benefit disappears, avoidance ramps up. That escalation wasn't your fault. It was the system protecting itself. Spirit wants you to release the idea that you were left because you weren't enough. The truth is, you were too aware for someone invested in staying unconscious. Awareness forces choice. Choice demands courage. And courage was the missing piece, not feelings. In next part, Spirit flips the focus fully onto you. How this experience recalibrated your standards, rewired your nervous system, and made you incompatible with half-truths forever. Now Spirit shifts the lens, because this message was never meant to trap you in their limitations. It's meant to anchor you in your transformation. What you gained from this wasn't fear, it was calibration. You don't romanticize unreturned effort anymore. You don't confuse longing with love. You don't mistake inconsistency for depth. That alone means you can't be pulled into the same kind of dynamic again, even if it shows up wearing a different face. Spirit shows your emotional field is quieter now, not numb, not detached, just grounded. You trust yourself. You don't interrogate situations to feel safe anymore. You observe. You let patterns show themselves. That patience isn't passive, it's power. This is also why certain people and situations feel off now. Even if they used to feel familiar, familiarity was built on tolerance, not alignment. And now that your tolerance has shifted, what once felt normal feels misaligned. That's not distance. That's honesty. Spirit gently points out something important. You don't need to keep analyzing the past. The lesson already integrated. You're living it in real time through what you accept, what you decline, and what no longer excites you. Reflection is fine, but looping is unnecessary. The wisdom is already active. There may be a quiet grief that surfaces here, not grief for them, but grief for the innocence that believed love could fix misalignment. That grief deserves compassion. Hope isn't weakness, it's openness. And openness is sacred. It only hurts when it isn't met with responsibility. Spirit says the emotional fog has lifted for a reason. You can now see the pattern without distortion, not to harden you, but to free you from cycles that required you to abandon your own rhythm just to stay connected. Your next connections will feel different, not louder, not chaotic, just steady. And at first, steadiness might feel unfamiliar. Chaos once masqueraded as chemistry, so peace may feel quiet before it feels safe. That doesn't mean something's missing. It means your nervous system is detoxing from adrenaline-based attachment. You're less reactive now, less tempted to chase answers, less inclined to fix misalignment. That's not shutdown. That's sovereignty. You're no longer managing other people's inner worlds. Spirit reframes boundaries in a powerful way. Boundaries aren't walls. They're filters. They decide what gets access. Before, you gave access based on potential. Now you give access based on behavior. That's growth. You don't need closure conversations. Closure already happened through comprehension. You know why it didn't work. You know what was missing. You know what you require now. That's the door closing, softly, permanently. Here's the truth Spirit wants anchored. You didn't lose a future. You were redirected away from one that would have required constant self-negotiation. The future you're aligned with now doesn't make you chase clarity. It offers it. You're no longer available for half-truths, not because you're demanding, but because you value coherence. Words matching actions, effort matching intention, presence matching promise. That doesn't make you difficult. It makes you ready. If you feel lighter instead of angry, calmer instead of confused, stay close. The next messages aren't about healing anymore. They're about living from alignment.